So here's the lowdown on where this whole absurd saga began, and trust me, it's a place where petty grudges and ridiculous rules rule the roost. I live in this quaint little condo complex, a supposed tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone's business and the drama never stops. But if you ask me, it's more like a pressure cooker waiting to blow up at any given moment. I mean, come on, we're all adults, right? Yet somehow petty squabbles over noise levels and parking spaces turn into full-blown soap operas. And if you think you've seen drama, wait till you hear about our resident, Karen. Let me set the scene a little better. Our condo complex is a modest, two-story building with a handful of units that supposedly foster community spirit. In theory, we're all neighbors looking out for one another. In reality, it's a collection of micromanagers, busybodies, and, of course, entitled personalities who think they're above the rest. Picture perfectly trimmed hedges, paint that's a tad too pristine, and a common area that's more about showing off your gardening skills than actually relaxing. It's the kind of place that screams we care about appearances even if it means sacrificing any semblance of actual neighborly kindness. Now, I'm not one to boast, but I've always prided myself on being a reasonably smart, low-key person who just wants to live my life in peace. Sure, I have my quirks, like obsessively checking my state-of-the-art security cameras, even though I never really thought I'd need to, because who in their right mind would mess with me? But mostly, I'm just here doing my own thing. I work from home, I have a cat who's way too judgmental, and I like my space just the way it is, untouched by the unnecessary chaos of nosy neighbors. I'm all for a little community spirit, but not when it involves someone prying into your personal business. Enter Karen. And not just any Karen, the epitome of the entitled, self-righteous, micromanaging HOA board member. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term, Karen has become synonymous with someone who wields their power like a weapon against anyone who dares to deviate from their narrow view of how things should be. Karen in our complex is the self-appointed arbiter of proper behavior. She's the type who patrols the hallways with a clipboard in hand, ready to call out any slight infraction, no matter how trivial. And let me tell you, when Karen gets on her high horse, you better believe that nothing is sacred. You see, from day one, Karen made it clear that she wasn't going to let any form of disorder or individuality slip by unnoticed. Whether it was the placement of my outdoor furniture or the volume of my late-night playlists, nothing was ever good enough for her. I remember one instance when I simply had the audacity to leave a couple of mismatched cushions outside. Apparently, in her eyes, that was a blatant disregard for the aesthetic harmony of the entire complex. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. The tension between Karen and several of us in the complex had been building for a while. There were hushed conversations in the lobby, side-eye glances in the hallways, and enough whispered gossip to rival a high school rumor mill. I wasn't the only one who had grown tired of her constant meddling. In fact, a small group of residents had even started unofficially banding together to vent about her antics online. But then again, complaining on an online forum is one thing, dealing with it in person is a whole other beast. I've always tried to stay out of her way, keeping my head down and not engaging in any of the drama that seemed to swirl around her like a personal storm cloud. I mean, why invite trouble when you've got everything you need to live comfortably within your own four walls? That's why I invested in a top-of-the-line security system, complete with cameras that I honestly only glanced at every now and then. It was more of a just-in-case measure until, well, it turned out I really needed it. Looking back, it's almost laughable how oblivious I was to the brewing storm. I had my little bubble of tranquility, convinced that as long as I didn't poke my nose into everyone else's affairs, I'd be safe from the wrath of the community watchdog. But of course, fate had other plans. The conflicts between Karen and some of my neighbors were a constant source of irritation, and I'd heard plenty of dramatic stories from others about her tirades and confrontations. Yet, I kept thinking this isn't going to affect me. I've done nothing to deserve her disdain. The community meetings were a whole other level of absurdity. Karen would stand up, completely inflamed with a sense of moral superiority, and lecture everyone about how we were all failing to uphold the standards of our little utopia. It was like watching a badly scripted reality TV show, except the stakes were way higher because it was my home we were talking about. Everyone nodded along, not out of genuine agreement, but because no one wanted to incur her wrath. It was a silent, begrudging consensus: obey Karen or face the consequences. Even the building's management seemed to cower under her influence. I mean, if you've ever had the misfortune of dealing with an overly zealous HOA board member, you know that management ends up being the poor sap who has to smooth over the fallout. And in our complex, Karen's word was practically law. It wasn't that she was incompetent, far from it. She just had this uncanny ability to twist any situation to her advantage, often at the expense of common sense and basic neighborly respect. As for me, I always assumed that my life would continue in this bizarre, semi-peaceful routine. I'd come home, fire up my computer, maybe have a quick chat with my cat, who, frankly, is the only one who truly understands me, and retreat into the comforting glow of my screens. I had absolutely no idea that the tranquility I so carefully curated was about to be shattered by someone who thought the world revolved around their own ridiculous sense of order. That's when I started noticing the subtle signs of an impending explosion. It wasn't just the usual snide comments from Karen or the discreet complaints whispered behind closed doors. It was the tangible tension that clung to the hallways like a thick fog. Conversations would abruptly end when she entered the room, and the air would seem to crackle with barely contained anger. There were moments when even I, despite my best efforts to remain detached, could feel the oppressive pressure of her presence. And deep down, I knew that something big was coming, something that would force everyone to confront the true meaning of community. So, as I sit here and look back on those early days, I can't help but chuckle at how naive I was. I thought I had everything under control, that my quiet existence would keep me out of harm's way. But in a world where entitled people like Karen dictate the rules, no one is ever truly safe. And little did I know that my state-of-the-art security system, which I barely paid attention to, would soon become the unwitting witness to one of the most dramatic events in our little condo complex. It was around midnight, and I was half asleep, still buzzing from the day's mundanity. I had just settled down with a cup of lukewarm tea because, hey, it was already too late for a fresh brew when I heard it, a noise that instantly snapped me from my daze. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling around, a common occurrence in our old building. But then came the unmistakable sound, a sharp, crashing shatter that ripped through the silence like a siren's wail. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding like I just sprinted a marathon, and fumbled my way to the living room. My eyes, still adjusting to the darkness, caught the glint of broken glass scattered across the floor. There it was, my window, once a pristine, secure barrier to the outside world, now a jagged mess of shattered fragments. And standing in the middle of the chaos, partially illuminated by the erratic glow of a streetlight outside, was none other than Karen. Yes, that Karen, the self-righteous, overzealous enforcer of our HOA's so-called standards. I swear, at that moment, I half expected her to whip out a clipboard and start lecturing me on proper window aesthetics. Instead, she was there with a look of smug satisfaction on her face, as if she'd just single-handedly rid the complex of all my perceived wrongdoings. I froze, caught in a bizarre blend of shock, anger, and disbelief. How on earth had she managed to get so close to my apartment without me noticing? And what on earth was her grand plan? Clearly, she was on a mission to terrorize me, to remind me loud and clear that I was the odd one out in this little paradise of conformity. The timing was impeccable. With the clock deep in the witching hour, the whole act felt like a scene ripped straight out of a bad horror movie. The sound of shattering glass echoed in my mind as I backed away slowly, my pulse racing. Every instinct screamed for me to run, to hide, or at the very least, dial 911. But then, a part of me, yes, that part one always thought was too naive, realized that this wasn't just some random act of vandalism. No, it was a calculated move, a message sent by Karen, and oh boy, was it loud and clear. As I stood there, processing the scene in front of me, I began to notice details that would soon become the cornerstone of my case. The shards of glass weren't just scattered randomly. They formed a sort of chaotic pattern around the window frame, almost as if they were deliberately placed. There were tiny, almost imperceptible scratches on the window sill, marks that could only have been made by someone wielding a heavy object with malicious intent. And then there were the fingerprints. At first glance, I thought they were smudges from my own hurried movements, but on closer inspection, I realized they were distinct, multiple sets. In fact, this wasn't an accident. It was a premeditated act. I remember feeling a cold surge of adrenaline mixed with a bitter sense of betrayal. Here I was, just trying to live my life in a peaceful, if not slightly overprotected, bubble, and Karen decided that her way was the only way to enforce order. It was infuriating. I could almost hear her inner monologue, her mind racing with all the proper things that needed to be done, all the rules that were being flouted by my mere existence. She thought that by smashing my window, she would send a clear message: you don't belong here if you can't follow my rules. But what she failed to realize was that actions like hers have a way of backfiring. In that surreal moment, My mind raced through every possible scenario. Was this a one-off tantrum, or was it the beginning of a relentless campaign of harassment? Couldn't tell. The fact that it happened in the dead of night only made it worse, as it left me feeling vulnerable and exposed in a place that was supposed to be my sanctuary. It was like waking up in the middle of a nightmare that you can't quite shake off. A nightmare that redefines what safety means. The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on me. Here I was, the epitome of the quiet, keep-to-myself type, suddenly thrust into the center of a drama that would rival the most scandalous reality TV shows. And it wasn't just about the window. It was about the sheer audacity of someone using their self-proclaimed authority to terrorize a neighbor, all under the guise of community standards. The whole debacle reeked of entitlement and, frankly, a complete lack of perspective. As I stood in that dimly lit living room, the broken glass crunching under my feet with every cautious step I took, I could hear my own thoughts echoing in the silence. "This is insane," I muttered to myself. "Who does she think she is?" The answer, I soon realized, was simple. Someone who believed that the rules of the community existed solely to serve her personal vendettas. Someone who saw herself as the guardian of morality in a world that, in her eyes, was spiraling into chaos. In the aftermath of the crash, I couldn't help but think about the implications. Every shatter of glass, every scratch, every misaligned piece of the window was a symbol of the escalating power struggle within our community. It wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about control. Karen was making it abundantly clear that she was willing to go to extreme lengths to enforce her warped vision of perfection. And while I'd always thought that I'd never have to deal with something so dramatic, fate had a wicked sense of humor. I scrambled to gather evidence, snap a few hurried photos with my phone, jot down every detail while it was fresh in my mind. Even in that fraught state, a part of me couldn't help but marvel at the irony of it all. I had invested in a state-of-the-art security system, one I mostly used for its just-in-case factor. Now, it was coming to the forefront of what might be the biggest showdown of my life. Little did Karen know, her little midnight stunt was about to be recorded for all eternity. As I backed away from the shattered remains of my window, every nerve in my body was on high alert. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the reality of the situation sank in. In that dark, unsettling moment, I realized that Karen had not only broken a window, but had also shattered the illusion of safety I had so carefully built around myself. What was once a reliable fortress of solitude now bore the scars of an act of pure, unadulterated spite. The tension in the air was almost palpable as I contemplated my next move. The incident had laid bare an ugly truth. No amount of security, no matter how advanced, could shield me from the madness of entitlement. Karen had taken something that was precious to me, a sense of peace, of privacy, and turned it into a weapon against my very existence. And while a part of me was seething with anger, another part recognized the sheer audacity of the act. It was bold, it was reckless, and it was exactly the kind of behavior that deserved to be documented and exposed. I sprinted over to my computer and logged into the security system's dashboard. I was half expecting nothing more than a few blurry images or an inconclusive recording, but what I found was pure gold. Every single moment of that fateful night had been captured in crystal-clear detail. Karen's face, her every move, even the way she handled that hammer like it was a magic wand of tyranny. I rewound the footage, watching in disbelief as Karen strolled up to my window like she owned the place. Her posture, her sneer, it was all there, documented for eternity. I couldn't help but laugh, a mix of disbelief and satisfaction bubbling up inside me. Here I was, thinking my little security system was just a nice-to-have, and now it was the ultimate trump card. I grabbed my phone and called up a couple of my tech-savvy friends, folks who not only knew their way around security gadgets but also shared my disdain for entitled HOA tyrants. We set up a little virtual meeting and dove deep into the video footage together. We scrutinized every frame, pausing at the exact moment when Karen raised her hammer and smashed my window. I could see the glint of malice in her eyes, the confidence of someone who believed she was infallible. But then, something else caught our attention. The way she lingered near my door, casting furtive glances around as if she expected someone to catch her in the act. It was all so deliberate, One friend even pointed out a tiny detail, a slight hesitation before she swung the hammer, as if she was savoring the moment of rebellion. We all agreed. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment fit. It was a meticulously planned display of power. Armed with this damning evidence, I felt my initial fear morphing into a burning determination. Every bit of that video became a badge of honor for me. It wasn't just a recording. It was my proof that Karen had overstepped every conceivable boundary. I started taking detailed notes, jotting down the timestamps, and making copies of each critical segment of the footage. I even reached out to a friend who happens to be a lawyer, because when you're dealing with someone who thinks they can bully you into submission, you need all the legal firepower you can get. I spent hours meticulously analyzing the video, frame by frame. It was like piecing together a puzzle, and with each new discovery, I felt my confidence soar. I wasn't just some passive victim anymore. I was now a man on a mission. I compiled a detailed dossier, complete with screenshots, timestamps, and even my own commentary on every incriminating move Karen made. Every piece of evidence was stacked in my favor, ready to be unleashed at the right moment. In between my late-night evidence-gathering sessions, I started planning my next move. I mean, let's be honest. Karen had always prided herself on being the moral compass of our little community. She believed that her version of order was the only acceptable one, and that she had the authority to enforce it. Well, now that the tables were turning, I was ready to flip the script. I was no longer just a bystander in Karen's self-appointed regime. I was armed with undeniable proof of her misdeeds, and I was prepared to expose her hypocrisy for all to see. As I delved deeper into the evidence, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. There was a part of me that still felt that initial sting of vulnerability, that nagging fear from the moment I saw my broken window. But that fear was rapidly being replaced by a steely resolve. Every time I watched Karen's smug expression in the video, I felt a surge of righteous anger. I was no longer going to let her terrorize not just me, but everyone in our community. It was time to stand up to the overbearing, entitled bully who had made our lives miserable for far too long. I started sharing the evidence with a few trusted neighbors. These were people who, like me, had grown tired of Karen's dictatorial ways. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. Neighbors who had once whispered their complaints in hushed tones now found their voices. They were fed up with the constant surveillance, the arbitrary fines, and the never-ending lectures on community standards. I even created a shared folder online where everyone could review the footage at their leisure. It wasn't long before word spread like wildfire, and suddenly, I wasn't alone in my fight against Karen. The more we looked at the footage, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just breaking windows. She was systematically abusing her power. We combed through other recordings from around the complex, and while my incident was the most dramatic, it was only one piece of a much larger pattern of behavior. It was like the proverbial tip of the iceberg. Every time Karen patrolled the hallways, every time she stopped by a neighbor's door uninvited, it reinforced the idea that she believed she was above the rules. And now, thanks to the security cameras, we had irrefutable evidence to prove it. I could feel the momentum building. What started as a personal affront had evolved into a full-blown movement. I wasn't just gathering evidence for my own case. I was igniting a spark among the entire community. People who had been too intimidated to speak up were suddenly finding their voices, emboldened by the knowledge that the truth was on our side. And as the digital dossier grew, so did our collective resolve to reclaim our rights and restore sanity to our neighborhood. With every passing night, I would sit in front of my computer, rewatching the footage and fine-tuning the evidence. I meticulously cataloged every incriminating moment, the way Karen's hands trembled ever so slightly when she reached for the hammer, the dismissive glance she threw over her shoulder as if daring someone to challenge her authority. Each detail, no matter how minute, was a thread in the tapestry of her misconduct. I reached out to that lawyer friend again, this time with the complete dossier in hand. Over a series of late-night calls, we discussed the legal implications of the evidence. He was as appalled as I was by Karen's blatant abuse of power, and he assured me that if I decided to take this to the HOA board or even pursue legal action, we'd have a strong case. The idea of turning the tables on Karen, of holding her accountable for every tyrannical act, filled me with a heady mix of anticipation and satisfaction. But perhaps the most transformative moment for me was not the legal consultations or the community meetings. It was the personal realization that I had shifted from a state of fear to one of empowerment. Watching Karen's recorded actions, I began to see her for what she truly was: an insecure, overcompensating individual who projected her own inadequacies onto everyone else. The more I analyzed the footage, the more I understood that her need for control was nothing more than a mask for her own inner chaos. I realized that this wasn't just about a broken window anymore. It was about standing up for my own dignity and for the dignity of everyone who had been silently suffering under Karen's reign. With every frame of video, I was reclaiming my sense of self and sending a clear message to anyone who thought they could bully me. I'm not going to take it lying down. And so, armed with my digital dossier, the unwavering support of my neighbors, and the knowledge that justice was within reach, I prepared for the inevitable showdown. Karen's carefully constructed facade of authority was crumbling, and I was ready to expose the truth in all its raw, unfiltered glory. I knew that once the evidence was laid bare, there would be no turning back. The community would finally see the full extent of her abuse, and together, we'd demand the change we deserved. In that moment, as I watched the final playback of the damning footage, I couldn't help but smile. The narrative was shifting, and I was at the helm of this revolution against entitlement. Karen's days of unchecked tyranny were numbered, and every pixel of that video was a step toward reclaiming our neighborhood, our peace, and our dignity. Trust me, this was only the beginning, and soon, the full-scale counterattack against the reign of the self-appointed community enforcer would be unleashed. I called for an emergency community meeting at the common area, a space that, until now, had been nothing more than a passive backdrop to Karen's incessant lectures. As I stood before a room full of residents, I could feel the tension crackling in the air. There was a palpable sense of unity among us. We were all here, ready to confront the injustice that had plagued our daily lives for far too long. I began by calmly laying out the timeline of events, my voice steady and unwavering as I recounted the night of the window smashing. I then played the video evidence on the big screen, a sequence so clear and irrefutable that even the most skeptical neighbor couldn't deny what they were witnessing. Karen's smug expression, her deliberate actions, every single detail was on full display for everyone to see. The room erupted with murmurs of disbelief and outrage. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was the collective story of a community oppressed by an overzealous enforcer. Karen tried to interject, her voice shaky as she attempted to justify her actions, claiming she was upholding community standards. But the evidence was louder than any of her excuses. Every comment she made was met with cold stares and whispered retorts. I didn't need to raise my voice. The undeniable proof of her misconduct silenced her more effectively than any reprimand could. The turning point came when a few long-suffering neighbors, who had been too afraid to speak out before, stepped forward to share their own experiences of being harassed and belittled by Karen. Their testimonials, combined with the video evidence, created an avalanche of public discontent that the HOA couldn't ignore. It became crystal clear: Karen had not been the guardian of our community. She had been its oppressor. In the aftermath of the meeting, the consequences were swift and decisive. Karen was forced to issue a public apology for her actions and the unwarranted intimidation she had imposed on us all. The HOA, under mounting pressure, revised its policies, introducing clear guidelines to ensure that no one could ever abuse their power in such a manner again. The new rules emphasized transparency, respect, and, most importantly, the right of every resident to feel safe and valued in their own home. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, the lesson was painfully clear. Technology, when used correctly, can be a powerful tool to protect our rights and expose injustice. It also taught us that a community united by a common cause can overcome even the most tyrannical figures. Karen's fall from grace was a victory for every resident who had longed for a neighborly environment free from fear and tyranny. And as I look back on that fateful day, I can't help but feel a deep sense of pride knowing that together, we reclaimed our home from the grip of entitlement and turned the tide of injustice.